Morrow of the Golden Age, Chapter 12. We have said much about the affairs of Prince Paracedes, and truthfully, the most important things that happened around this time are yet to be described. Now though, I shall relay all I have learned about the placation of the First Lands at the hands of King Spartacus, who saw fit to build his empire from the very mud alongside his people. During the Getae Wars and the schemes of Amadocus, Spartacus faced vicious battle and fallen half men in even greater quantities, so far from everything else that occurred that even the most mundane details seem like they are emerging from a myth. Perhaps you, as I, find this endlessly endearing. After the departure of the Ilani from the environs of Sarai, the city had been reconnected fully to the empire. The process of establishing a road from Tanais to the Hyrcanian Ocean began in 182, with a decade of work to be done because of the empty, exposed distance it needed to conquer. Some elements of the royal administration in Tanais were moved to Sarai so that the king could perform his duties, and the nobles were begging him to return to Tanais to attend to various matters there. Above all, that the power of the old nobility was slipping not only towards Chariskos, but now towards wherever Paracedes was marching his invincible army in the west. As ever, Spartacus had no intention of leaving his new territories without them being prepared to his satisfaction, which was a shifting and always distant guideline. Furthermore, he was rightly not able to rely on a full partnership of trust with the Alani. Since they had left quite suddenly and with surprisingly amiable overtures, there was anticipation of a sting to come, a price to be repaid. They had actually gone and achieved something remarkable, which was only possible because of the year-on-year rejuvenation of the First Lands. This rejuvenation took the form of deepening soil and heightening grass, signalling the readiness of the ground for cultivation. It was the work of Gwena Greek-speaker and Prince Paracedes who should be credited for this, as the restoration of the land was the dividend of all the blood properly spilled, and the adoption of cattle sacrifice across the various places that had come to be inhabited in the First Lands over the prior 15 years. There is plenty of testimony that the lands were not like this beforehand, so cast all doubt aside. The state of the land prompted the Alani and their many client peoples to go to the rivers and harvest wild plants, and quickly they were able to employ their foreign slaves to make this process reliable and cyclical. In other words, they began to farm the land, and that is something remarkable for nomads, who long considered farming to be childish, weak, and even sacrilegious. Perhaps their time marveling upon Sarai and feeling the spears and arrows of city folk had tempered their senses such that the truth of the world seemed to reflect more honestly. Yet a large change like this cannot be achieved without good order already being in place. Since this condition was not satisfied, all that was new in the lands near Sarai was in a state of turmoil, and of these things did the city come to know when their scouts charting the river came upon a nomad colony and were robbed of all their possessions and then their lives. Only one man escaped, and it was by taming a wild horse that he was able to return to Sarai over the course of several weeks. It is said that he was so withered and injured by his journey that he was not able to tell of what had occurred. However, he had relayed the story to the horse, and the horse explained everything clearly. You may question this, but certain horses, whose nobility is far above the common sort, are known to have been able to speak. This one was wise enough to know his value, and retreated to return to his family before the Bosporans sought to profit from him further. Of the rider, he did not long survive, and Spartacus saw to his funeral at the kingdom's expense, along with the 30 others lost to the enemy. On that same day, a band of Alani came bearing tribute to Spartacus, seeking only to exchange news on the affairs of both their peoples. Or so it seemed. They reported some of what I have recounted above, to the effect that they were content to stay in the northern parts of the region where there was increasingly good pasture. But they also claimed that the group who had assaulted the scouts were none other than the rowdy Saka who had also planned the raid on Tanais in previous years. This, recall, was responsible for the death of several of Spartacus's children, and so it was without delay that muster was called, and Spartacus himself set off the next morning. The rest of the army was to rush after him, and there was barely time to prepare weapons, leaving none for explaining to the people what was transpiring, creating unnecessary panic and prompting some civilians to follow the army out of fear. Supposedly Spartacus did not notice, or perhaps he knew that he would have use for healthy civilians once he reached his destination. His only decree with any business aside from that which had caught his nose was that the city be left under the stewardship of Prince Dion, who was his surviving son. We shall detail the feats of Dion in time, and for now you need only know that he was much like his father, and his father had planned for this to be so carefully. The growing army travelled along the river. There were no roads, the distance was long, and the rate of travel limited. For months did they march, reliant upon the purchasing of supplies from nomads and the bringing of boats up the river, especially as this campaign took place in the middle of winter. It was in the spring of 181 that Spartacus came to a town, later called Raha, which is in fact a Syrian word that implies spring. This was where this band of boisterous Saka were living, and there can be no doubt in retrospect that they had caused the Alani trouble and consternation, and the coming of the Bosporans to do battle here was as much a machination of the nomads as any alluring feint or disarming tribute. Let us describe the action that now occurred. Spartacus had some 2,000 to 3,000 soldiers in his employ, although how many of them were present when he arrived at Raha is not recorded. Indeed, the speed at which the arrival led to battle was so fast that many following their officers might not have expected to see battle at all. In essence, Spartacus moved into Raha as if he had already conquered it, not stopping to encamp even though it was already dusk. The Saka townspeople fled, although few had horses and so many were taken captive. By the time it was fully dark, his vanguard had taken possession of the heights the town was sited on, and from there the measure of what truly opposed them could be taken. In the fields beyond this hill, around 10,000 warriors lived in a string of camps arrayed along the river that came right up to the edge of the town, mixing the wood huts of the farmers right into the traditional neighborhoods of sturdy tents, delineated by clan wagons. In the moonlight, it could be determined that there were only a few horses pasturing nearby. In truth, these people had minimal wealth in horses, for they had traded them for the many things they had hoped would aid in their efforts to cultivate the land. Now this was to be their doom, because when Spartacus saw how the camps stretched away from the town, he knew that to bring battle to them that very night would render the mustering of his enemy impossible, and that is exactly what he did, despite being unable to muster himself. Torches, candle reeds, and oils were distributed from the town to his spearmen, who went down to challenge the first of the many camps. Since there was torchlight here and there across the town and in its surrounds, the Saka could not tell how many enemies they faced, and would even mistake their own formations for enemy ones. Such is the madness of night fighting. But Spartacus had guile enough to stomach it, and strong leashes on his men, forged by drill, discipline, and scoldings that progressed into legend. In the chaos of dark, with blood falling all about, hearing the word of the king was like waking up in a vibrant meadow, and following his orders was an equal pleasure, be the ground ahead visible or concealed. Thus there was fighting at the first of the enemy camps, in which the Saka were hardly willing to participate, and they were made to flee or die among their tents. Reinforcements from the second camp arrived in the nearby fields, and Spartacus deftly drew his men away from their looting and proceeded out into the field also, via 2 of the camp's exits, creating a battle to both sides of the arriving men. At first, the reinforcements thought they were being welcomed by their own troops, which goes to show how few of the original combatants survived the attack and took word of it elsewhere. This second group was better placed to flee, and since it was not known how many of them there were, Spartacus did not want to pursue. Instead, he brought his men back into the town and went about assuring the people that his rule would be fair. Yet this was not the end of it. There was a day of calm in which the troops slept and more Bosporans arrived from downriver. The coming of civilians here proved vital in replacing those who had been lost in the town. It was a fine offer for any freeman or enterprising noble to take up. However, it was contingent upon the final resolution of conflict. Throughout the day, the Saka had regrouped and established a unified camp on high ground within a few stadies of Raha. riders went this way and that, and it would be reasonable to assume they were planning to gather their resources before they counterattacked. After all, they were in lands that were populated with people like them, albeit sparsely, while the Bosporans were further from aid than they had ever been, a factor that Spartacus wasted no breath entertaining. Instead, he found all the troops who were waking from their exhaustion, and all of those who had slept the previous night and arrived during the day, and he sent them to challenge for battle as the sun was setting. Spartacus himself had not slept during the day for all the tasks and rulings he was required for, but he took up his usual position among his heavy footmen and followed the army out with a sword in his hand, and seeing this, no one else could dare say they were tired or lag behind. The sacker took up the offer of battle and lined up on the hillside. Spartacus did not attack initially and formed up nearby after giving his men a curious order that they should cover their shields with bundles of grass or not wield them at all. Then he had all torches extinguished so that his men were like shadows on the hillside, and nor could they especially make out their foe. Both sides waited like this, and most of the soldiers on either side probably thought that a return to their camps would be the result of this posturing. However, after 2 watches went by, Spartacus came alive amid his men and had the horns sounded. "So this is the will of the powers in these lands, ancient and mysterious," he shouted out. "Taketh much they will, and all shall know it. Beeth as much we must be, and let all the good light and good dark meet soundly at our table." With these cryptic words, seemingly sourced from beyond himself, he took his soldiers up the hill. At that moment the dark sky was becoming clear, and a full moon loomed over the battlefield. It was larger than any could remember, and brighter too. Spartacus had been given foreknowledge of this, and hence we see the springing of his trap. He had his troops take up their shields and strip away any coverings they had made. Bosporan shields, since the time of Hyaenon, had been painted a bright white, and so with the powerful energy of the moon descending down to lather the field, their shield wall was like an approaching star to the sacker, who howled with fear. I suspect they saw this host as a legion of wraiths seeking revenge against those who had not aided them in the prior battle. Or even if they knew not the cause of the sight, it was unusual enough that they wished to not fight in its presence. As such, the gleaming shield wall was like the tip of a scythe skimming the grasslands and felling all in its path. While many of the sacker escaped, their camp was destroyed, and any hope they had for sustaining their rule over the new riverlands was vanquished by the coming of sunrise. Let those who say that Spartacus had no command of Manos's power remember times like these. Justice had been done, and the king had acquired important lands as recompense. There was further reward at hand as well. The Ilani had kept watchmen all around Raha who reported what had happened to their main horde. This horde was in a place even further north of the Hyrcanian Ocean, close to where the World End Forest must exist to its unexplored east. This place was the frontier of all that is known about the world, but to say this is to distinguish them from those lands even further away. That is to say, certain things were known about this place, called Old Scythia by some of the nomads, and called Brutha by the Morrow tribes. The name is taken to mean wall lands, with the implication that the wall is that of a home, keeping one's goodness in. It is supposed that at many points in history there have been peoples who emerged from these lands and approached the realms of civilization, in most cases to eventually become more or less civilized themselves. The Scythians, already half in bed with the Greeks, were perhaps the latest example. In the histories of the Lithotsis Manus, a like process occurred in the earliest times, when the inner seas were not yet civilized. It was the coming of Lithotsis colonists that made it so, and made the many cities and peoples that would ultimately grow apart, forgetful of their lineage. Even in the time when Spartacus was there were more peoples coming in from the east. And indeed the northern border had their own kinds of Lithotsis, although they were so different to those I usually use that term to refer to, that we must name them more discerningly to avoid confusion. They did not enter the course of affairs until after the tale I am covering now was long over, so set them out of your mind for the time being. This region is usually called the eastern edge of the First Lands, and I would go further and call it the eastern edge of the inhabited world. There are various places to the east of it, I freely grant you, yet they are not included on any map anyone cared to create, and there is no mention of embassy or even trade with peoples who live beyond this border. That there are such people is certain, or at least that there were, for it was from these places that armies sometimes came to disrupt Scythia and Sarmatia, as I have already said. Still, since it is not easy to travel to these places in the modern age, for reasons I shall presume are obvious to one with knowledge of recent history, all we can do is wonder what kinds of things those people are doing, if they yet live. It was there that the Alani were discovering more and more ideal sites for colonies, and they had begun the process of learning how to control and cultivate territory for themselves. When they discovered how quickly the Saka had been wiped aside, they were terrified of what Spartacus would do if he followed the Dikos River even further north and found the Alani's private lands. Even though the Alani detested the Saka in question, some even say the reason those people had so few horses was that the Alani had seized them all and banished the people from their nomad columns. They were humbled by the Bosporan campaign. This only added to the humiliation they had suffered in their inability to displace the colonists from Sarai, and it seemed to them that the world was closing around them, their backs being pressed up against those figurative wall lands. In another sense, though, they were impressed that Spartacus had managed to achieve all this, and he was certainly the first to tame the steppe in this way. It was this combination of attitudes that explained their humble approach to treating with the Greeks. I will describe briefly what happened over a period of years in this regard. The Ilani sent embassies to Raha and were surprised to find Spartacus was still there even a year after it had been captured, as he was studiously seeing to its development into a place that could bring cereal crops to Sarai. Sarai's best land was more suitable for growing fruit trees than crops, I am told, and there are various considerations that go into agricultural decisions of that kind, which Spartacus was an expert in. A dialogue was opened, in which eventually the Ilani were granted the rights to keep Old Scythia as a recognized territory, in exchange for paying tribute to Sarai. This may seem like a harsh deal, but remember the Ilani were essentially freeing themselves from what had been thousands of years of warfare by agreeing to ally to Spartacus, and indeed after 180 was over, the first lands were united in peace in their entirety at last. It was an underrated achievement, and Spartacus hardly helped by refusing any honours or ceremonies that his augurs offered him. He had a different view of what he needed to do, because of the continuous stream of letters he had been receiving from the West, telling of all the various details of the Getae War I have already recounted, and more things that infuriated the king and at last demanded that he deputize his able companions to take up his work in the east and rush to regain control of his empire. Why did his tolerance for his brother's power dry up so suddenly? Partially it was because the full canon of what the Getae treasures had revealed was beginning to be transmitted across the land by a certain project of Gwena Greek-speaker, the Scions of Gold. Moreover, there was news of potentially scandalous family affairs that certainly seemed to have taken place without proper subordination to the head of the household, which concerned Peiresedes' dealings with the Roman Republic. This is the point in the story when they begin to be called the Roman Empire, in symphony with the official designation of the Bosporan Empire beginning to be used by the royal house in 180. Here the Bosporan Empire ceased to be an idea, a shorthand, a flag, and instead was a true and stone-wrought institution, with order forever their watchword. While Spartacus begins his journey to the west, let us attend to how the rogue leaders of said empire brought all this about.